Is Bitcoin money? Let's do this. This is how the discussion usually flows on this topic. I've seen it many times among people and in cyberspace on the internet. Somebody makes the statement or the assumption that Bitcoin is money. And then you get somebody else who says, no, it's not. And then you get the first person saying, yes, it is. And then you get somebody a little bit angrier shouting, no, it's not. And then you get a person who uses Bitcoin as money saying, yes, it is. And it ends up sort of pretty much coming down to a discussion about definition, which ends with, well, you obviously don't understand what the definition of money is, right? And you can see the angry old man or bitter old lady, and it doesn't have to be elderly, by the way. They could be a younger person, but they are typically older people from an older generation who respond in this way. So before we get into discussing the answer to this question, let's just touch on why people actually get so emotional about this topic. And the main reason is obviously the psychology behind the reaction to challenging somebody's very core and existing beliefs. The way that we store value and the way that we exchange value with each other is something which is ingrained and which is fundamental to how we interact with other beings from a very young age. From the age of less than 1, children learn that to have certain things, be it access to milk or be it access to their mother, is something that they can demand and that they would like to have. And over time, we obviously develop far more complex processes for obtaining what we want and for interacting with others. And so the term money, which we use as a medium of exchange and as a store of value, is something which becomes very ingrained. Almost all humans, and I think you could probably find studies of other primates who exchange certain things in return for certain things in return. So this is why it's so emotional. And again, as I've discussed in prior videos, people can become very ingrained and entrenched in existing categorizations and thought processes. And so a challenge to that creates a range of reactions among people. And some of those reactions actually are anger, denial, grief, bargaining. And again, I won't go into that model in this presentation, but this explains why you get some of these reactions. Does the question even matter? Let me explain the story about the hunter and the duck and the goose, and then we'll really get on to answering the actual question. Once upon a time, there were 2 hunters, and they were very hungry, and they were out hunting, and they decided they really needed to catch some food. There were no vegetables around, so it was really important that they actually managed to kill and eat an animal. And so over in the distance, one of the hunters saw what he thought was a duck and said to his friend, "Look, there's a duck, shoot it." And the friend said, "That's not a duck, that's a goose." And the person who first saw it said, "No, it's a duck." And the other person said, "No, it's not, it's a goose." The first person said, "No, that is a duck." And the other hunter then shouted, "It is not. You obviously don't understand the definition of a duck." Sound familiar? What actually happened to the animal, regardless of whether it was a duck or a goose? It flew off, and the hunters didn't get their meal and remained hungry. The lesson of that story is that sometimes arguing about definitions is irrelevant in terms of the ultimate goal. Please bear that in mind as we go forwards here. And in a conversation recently with Vitalik Buterin, his response to this, he's very conscious of this in his space, obviously, he refers to these definitions and arguments about definitions as word taboos. And in his mind, again, especially as a technologist, they are actually irrelevant as to what the underlying technology actually does. From his perspective, you can give any kind of name to these things, but whatever name you give them is relevant as to the purpose and the function and the technology behind what these things actually are. So let's now move forward into this. The reality is that when people ask this question or argue about it, what they really are trying to figure out is a number of things. Is Bitcoin something that I can use as money, as I use other types of money that I'm familiar with, such as physical pieces of paper with numbers written on it? Is Bitcoin something that will be used as money in the future? Because of course, what happens in the future, if we knew or we had a degree of certainty or likelihood, we could act now to benefit from it. And really what they're asking or trying to figure out is, should I acquire some Bitcoin now? So just like with the hunters in the story that I told you, what they're really trying to figure out is not actually, is that a duck or a goose, but can I eat the damn thing? Okay, so the ultimate goal is to find out, should I acquire Bitcoin? And how we figure that out is through the application of logic. Okay, so we're going to have a rational, unemotional discussion, regardless of names, and we're not going to get involved in name calling or telling people that they are silly or any of those things. Let's just apply the logic here. The core properties of money, or at least what I think are the core properties, are as follows. The first is scarcity and a limitation in supply. Clearly, if something is highly abundant, then it can't be used for bargaining with others because it's freely available, and why would somebody give you something that they can already get for free? So that's why, except in very extraordinary cases, we don't bargain over things like air or water. Although increasingly, as we can see, as these resources do become scarce, we do start actually bargaining over things like water or water quality or air. In the right circumstances, air is very valuable. Okay, but typically the more freely available something is, the less valuable and the less useful it will function as money, which is why if you think about many countries where they've gone into hyperinflation, the country has printed more and more and more money until eventually that money is, for all intents and purposes, worthless. So on the scarcity metric and the limitation in supply metric, Bitcoin is better than most forms of fiat currency because it is perfectly scarce. So there's an absolute mathematically governed limit as to how much Bitcoin there will be. There will never be any more. Previously, in former times and even now, a legacy of wanting something that was scarce and very limited in supply was gold. So there were a range of reasons why gold was adopted as a form of money and as a store of value. One of those things was that gold is scarce. There definitely is a finite supply, although we don't know exactly what that finite supply is. And it involves a great deal of effort to create more of that particular gold, even though it's in a finite supply in the earth. And that's very much analogous to Bitcoin, only of course with Bitcoin we know right down to the exact Satoshi how much Bitcoin has been created and how much will ever be created. So gold may be more scarce than paper money, but Bitcoin is certainly more scarce and a more perfect form of scarcity and limitation of supply than gold. Fungibility. By fungibility, what we mean is that the unit that we have to transact with, which is something which is scarce or limited in supply, is perfectly interchangeable with another unit. So let's take bananas as an example. Bananas are not perfectly identical, and if we were to use bananas as a store of value, forgetting about other issues such as durability, one banana would not actually equate another banana. A rotten banana would not be as valuable as a fresh one, and a big banana would not be as valuable as a small one. With money, 100 US dollars will typically always equal 100 US dollars, and I will explain why not in all cases that is the case. And gold, in most cases, a kilogram of gold will equal a kilogram of gold. But again, there are issues there, which I'll get into in a moment. And of course, one Bitcoin, if it's fungible, will always equal one Bitcoin. It's very easy to have perfect fungibility when you're dealing with mathematics and with numbers in cyberspace, because you can have 100% accuracy. Now let's take the case of fiat currency. A $100 note, a fresh $100 note, actually does in some countries get a premium to a very old and tattered $100 note. I've seen that happen in certain countries, whereby the older a dollar note is, and it's happened in China a lot, the less willing somebody is to take it, to the point where they'll either reject it or they may ask for a discount. So that is paper money. In theory, it should be perfectly fungible. In reality, it's not. And even with gold, there are issues. Some people may not know for sure whether the gold is pure. There may be slight differences in the weight of gold, so you're not getting perfect accuracy. But with one Bitcoin will always equal one Bitcoin. Are Bitcoins identical? Well, that's an interesting one, because on the one hand, the entire blockchain is one thing. So all you're doing when you get access to a Satoshi or to a Bitcoin is you're getting part of that overall value that's stored on the blockchain. But arguably there is a distinction, and every person who has a Bitcoin has something unique that's recorded on the blockchain. So you could debate there whether or not one Bitcoin is exactly the same as another Bitcoin, just by the way as you could by saying that $1 note has a different serial number to another dollar note, but they're relatively fungible. But from a mathematical perspective, Bitcoin is as fungible, if not more fungible, than traditional monies that we've used, such as fiat currencies, paper currencies, and gold. And in some ways, the other benefit in terms of fungibility is that with paper money, if you're moving from one country to another, you need to exchange those currencies. There may not be fungibility. A lot of countries do now accept US dollars, but in a lot of cases, if you are going to a country, you're going to Australia, Korea, Japan, you might want to, or be required to, for practical purposes, to exchange your money from US dollars into Aussie dollars or Japanese yen. So there's no fungibility there. And in that exchange process, there's usually an intermediary who also takes a cut. So you're actually also losing value in that way. Whereas Bitcoin, assuming that one Bitcoin is always one Bitcoin, and a Bitcoin used in Argentina is also accepted in America, and it's the same Bitcoin that's accepted in Europe and globally, then you will have two benefits there, which is that it's fungible globally, and no friction in terms of the need to convert into a localized foreign currency. So the more that the Bitcoin ecosystem grows, both with the Bitcoin as a store of value and through use as a medium of exchange via the Lightning Network, the greater that global fungibility becomes. Portability. One function of money which most people say is important is the ability to move it. Some of us probably remember these stories, and I can't remember in which country it is, but they actually created these great big rocks which you could barely lift, that had circles in them, which were used as a form of money, but they were highly unportable. Paper money became relatively easier to port around because you have a numerical value written on that, and you could carry it around in your pocket. You could take it on a plane, and after 8 hours, fly it from one country to another. It became a bit more difficult when you had a lot of that money because, after a while you start filling up briefcases and houses and wheelbarrows, so that can become more difficult. Gold was adopted, and gold is relatively easy to store high amounts of value in and relatively portable, although I can tell you that carrying gold, if you're carrying a kilo of gold around, that's pretty damn heavy. And again, it's going to take you time if you're wanting to send a payment from one country to another. So then you have Bitcoin, and Bitcoin, because of its digital properties, is more portable than these other forms of money that we use. And Bitcoin can be sent on the base layer from one country to a person in another country in a matter of minutes, depending on the speed of the network and the current hash rate. And on the Lightning Network, the second layer over and above Bitcoin, obviously the money can be sent in a split second. So it's certainly far more portable. The other great thing about Bitcoin, as opposed to gold or paper money, of course, is that sending $1 million or $1 billion can be done as quickly as sending $10. And again, this is because of the unique digital properties. Sometimes when you talk about this with people, again, often of the older generation who aren't as natively digital, they will say something like, "Oh, well, in a negative way, by the way, Bitcoin is just, is vaporware in cyberspace. It's just cyberspace money." And the irony, of course, of that is that the electronic currency which they now have, the money which they think they have, the vast majority of that is not in paper form. It's in electronic form. And even worse, there's an element of risk because not only is it electronic, but it's with an intermediary, a custodian, who, if it's a bank, as an example, could well go under. So you have issues there with the fact that all you really have is a legal right against your bank who is holding the money for you. If that bank disappears or that holder disappears, you have no real recourse because that money's gone. Maybe the government will bail you out. Maybe they won't. Of course, it's entirely as electronic, but that's vulnerable to so many other things, including malware, fraud, duplication. Whereas obviously with Bitcoin, it's digital money, but there's no intermediary at all, and there is no ability to create duplication of that money or fake versions of that money, unlike what banks can easily do with their balance sheets. So in terms of portability, I think everyone would agree that Bitcoin hands down blows away other types of money that we currently use. Divisibility. Well, we do have dollar notes, and we then have coins, right? And in a lot of countries, we go down to 1 cent. That's not actually overly divisible. $1 can be divided at most 100 times into a physical form of it down to 1 cent. And it's also not practical to be carrying around 100 1 cents and multiple versions of currencies and denominations. But that is how we have interacted with physical paper money and how we've divided it in the past. Gold is divisible, but very poorly, right? You try paying something with a kilogram of gold and asking for change, it's going to be very difficult for you, and it involves a lot of energy and effort to divide that gold up, but in theory it's divisible. Bitcoin, of course, is infinitely divisible. Now some people will be confused and say, I thought there were only 21 million Bitcoins, so that's it. And this again, some people are just limited in their concept of mathematics, but you then explain to them that yes, there are 21 million Bitcoins, but each Bitcoin can be divided. And there are actually 100 million Satoshis that fit into one Bitcoin. So you kind of explain, a dollar has 100 cents. One Bitcoin actually has 100 million Satoshis. And then you might get some people saying, oh, okay, but what if all that gets used up? How are people going to divide the Satoshis? And of course, the answer to that is that on the second layer of the Lightning Network, there's an infinite number of ways that we can divide up an individual Satoshi. So Bitcoin, because of its electronic nature, is obviously infinitely divisible. So on that basis, combined with the others, it clearly has a superior form of the qualities that we are here talking about, which are core to money. Then we get to two other areas, and the first one is medium of exchange. And here we get a bit of this scenario of people yelling against each other again. Is it a medium of exchange? And we get down to definitions, and as Vitalik says, what did he say? Word taboos. So the people who use it as a medium of exchange will say, well, it's obviously a medium of exchange. I use it to transact. I use it on the Lightning Network. I also use it as a medium of exchange from converting fiat currency into what I consider a better store of value, being Bitcoin. I use it to pay for restaurants. I use it to pay for beers. I use it to pay for coffee. I use it to buy a house. And then, of course, you get the other side saying, well, I don't use it for that. And, they will say things like, oh, you try going to I don't know, you try paying for Bitcoin at a house and see how that works out for you. Or I can't pay for my school fees or my traffic fines or my taxes in Bitcoin. And so this is really one of these duck versus goose questions. Just because one person doesn't use it as a medium of exchange, that doesn't mean that it's not a medium of exchange or not capable of being a medium of exchange. I think everyone here would agree that it can be used as a medium of exchange. So the really discussion is, to what extent is it used as a medium of exchange, and to what extent can it be used as a medium of exchange, and to what extent will it likely be used as a medium of exchange in the future? That is the true question here. But clearly, it is a medium of exchange. You would have to be very, I don't know what the word is, very, very obstinate and closed-minded to not accept that it can be a medium of exchange, and that really the discussion, if anything, is about how broad that medium of exchange is currently. And then lastly, we get down to this discussion of a store of value. I've made another video on this. And again, this is a bit like in that last video I made, the scenario I used were two people arguing about whether a piece of string is long or is short. Bitcoin is clearly a store of value. The question is whether it is a good store of value, or how volatile that store of value is compared to other stores of value. That is really the actual question we should be asking. And the core point I made there is, if we look at something that we believe is a good store of value, such as paper money, what we know with certainty is that that money over time has declined and will decline to almost zero in terms of purchasing power, because that paper money is being infinitely produced. It has no limit. Whereas what we do know is that Bitcoin, since the time of its creation for now over a decade, has always increased in value compared to all forms of paper money globally. Now, past performance doesn't mean that future performance will continue. We don't know with certainty whether Bitcoin in the long term will continue the trend that it's had over the last 12 plus years in terms of increasing in value over time continuously. But this is something that we will have to figure out. So we know for sure it's a store of value. What we don't know with certainty is how good a store of value it will be in the long term. What we do know with certainty is that there could be and has been volatility in the short term. Okay, so it is a store of value, but Volatility is a factor that we need to bear in mind. The other thing we need to bear in mind is for what length of time we want to measure the effectiveness of it being a store of value. If I was to tell you that over a 10-year horizon, the value of a dollar was to gradually fall by 4% a year, over 10 years, you would have lost more than 50% of the value of that dollar. If I was to tell you that for Bitcoin, it would increase by 30% a year over the next 10 years, but that there would be a lot of volatility along the way where there would be ups and downs of 50%, 30%, 20%. But you had to take a choice as to what you would take at the end of that 10 years. You would clearly take the Bitcoin because the long-term trend, when averaged out and at its endpoint, would be vastly, vastly superior to the loss that you would have in your fiat currency. So this is also why the concept of hodling that you'll hear Bitcoiners talk about and taking a long-term perspective is important. If you do hold the belief that it's more likely than not likely that Bitcoin will have a continuous long-term upward trend. Okay, so I think we can all agree that Bitcoin has all the fundamental core characteristics that we typically equate with money, and in fact that in many ways it is a superior form of money in relation to all of those characteristics. And so ultimately, what a person is trying to figure out really is, should I have some Bitcoin? Not do I, not is it money or not, but should I be acquiring Bitcoin? And that in turn comes down to a very simple function of how do I value Bitcoin? Because most people, they have a lot of struggle with how to value an intrinsic asset. And that includes myself, by the way. As a value investor, I like being able to mathematically calculate for myself what an asset is worth. And that's very easy to do with yield producing assets such as a property or a stock. It becomes far more difficult to do with something that has an intangible value, such as a piece of art, or gold, or Bitcoin. And so the answer to this question is that the price of an intangible asset is a simple function of its supply versus demand. This is the most fundamental of economic concepts. So we know that Bitcoin is fixed in supply, and therefore we know that the variable here is demand. The simple answer is that if demand goes up over time, then price will go up. And if demand goes down over time, then price will decline. Sometimes, by the way, an increase in demand can have a psychological effect on others, creating a fear of missing out, a self-reinforcing effect, which leads to the price going up further. So to a lot of people, they see the price going up, they conclude that because the price is going up, they would want to have some Bitcoin, so the demand goes up. The fact that they and others have demand for Bitcoin further translates into the price going up, so there can be a positive feedback loop there. And this can also work the other way around. When people are selling off, there can be a negative feedback loop on demand declining. So again, I'm not going to tell you the answer as to where I think Bitcoin will go in the future. That's something you'll need to work out for yourself. But what I will tell you is this: for all those people really, arguing about whether Bitcoin is money or not, what you really are trying to figure out is, should I acquire some Bitcoin or not? And if you haven't acquired Bitcoin right at this moment, you will have a range of feelings, which might be frustration, it might be anger, confusion, maybe even a degree of jealousy. Put those emotions aside, because what you really just need to do is figure out, should I be acquiring Bitcoin now? And the answer to that question is, you'll need to figure out and be comfortable with your view as to whether you think over time Bitcoin and the demand for it will increase, or whether over time the demand for Bitcoin will decrease. And once you figure that out, you'll have your answer. So thank you. Let's wrap it up.